Hi, Year 10. It's Mrs. Edmonds, Miss Leifert and Miss Earnshaw here. We are going to... Oh, sorry. Hello.
Hello.
We're going to deliver a lesson that compares the effects of war in Kamikaze and the Emigrée. So these should both be poems that you've already learned about individually. And as you know from a previous lesson that you've done, one of the things that you'll have to do in your exam at the end of next year is compare a theme across two poems. So these are the poems that we've chosen to compare today. First thing that we need to discuss is how we'll form those points of comparison between the poems. So I don't know, Miss Leifert and Miss Earnshaw, should we just discuss some of the things that we think would be relevant themes in each poem and ones that might link them together, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it's important when you're starting to think about comparisons that you can look at similarities or differences, can't you?
Yeah.
I suppose in any similarity you draw out, you're then looking at the difference between how each poet presents that particular thing that links the poems.
That's exactly what I was just going to say.
Excellent. So is there anything that we see that kind of seems quite similar in any of the ideas they're trying to present about the effects of war? That would be where I'd start, probably, as I was thinking about comparisons.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, when we think, I suppose one of the important things to consider, first of all, is when we think of the effects of war, there's so many different ways that we could look at that, because some people might just look at it initially and think, well, if it's an effect of war, it must be a physical injury. But there's other things that we could consider, isn't there?
And I think actually with these two poems, that initial thought of an effect of war being injury or death or something along those lines isn't really there in these poems. It's not like some of our other war poems, is it, where that kind of idea is much more present? These are quite different, I suppose, to that.
Yeah, I know there is the kind of threat of physical effects of war in Kamikaze, aren't there? In the sense that if the pilot had gone through with his mission, the effects would very much be physical. Obviously, the poem ends with the word die, but it's, I would say, a metaphorical death in that poem, isn't it?
Yeah.
In that case, we need to think about the effects on the people in the poems, whether that's the speaker or the people they are talking about. So in Kamikaze, and I think in the Emigrée, there's this kind of sense of loss in both of the poems, isn't there? They're kind of losing something because of the war, whether that's the father in Kamikaze or the place and sense of identity that's connected to the place in the Emigrée.
Yeah,
and the father, him losing the connection to his family as a result of the way he's been treated by them, because he's not fulfilled these expectations, has he?
Yeah, probably even loss of belief in these ideas that have been drilled into him at the start of the poem.
Yeah. So are we saying our first comparison would be that in both poems a sense of loss is presented, and it's an individual or more than one individual who loses something, but the thing that they lose and the ideas presented about loss are quite different, because it's probably more to do with relationships in the Kamikaze, but it's to do with a place and the importance of that place in the Emigrée.
Yeah.
I think there's, even within those things, there's even more crossover there, isn't there?
Yeah.
So for Kamikaze then, where would you be taking your references from? Where do you think, which parts of the poem would you be commenting on to explore this idea of losing relationships and sort of a loss of family and a loss of the individual, maybe?
That, I think, I know this comes at the end, but the silence at the end of Kamikaze, I think, is really important. Till gradually we too learn to be silent.
I think that's a lovely reference, because it's get this sense of the isolation and the silence that he suffers because his family have cut him off. I always try and use the word ostracized when I talk about this poem, and that means sort of somebody who's cut off from a group because they don't quite fit in, doesn't it? So he's ostracized because he didn't fulfill this mission. So it's almost
He's made into an outsider, isn't he, in that sense?
Yeah, he's an
even within his own country, within his own family.
Yeah, definitely. And then it's almost a metaphor for the way he's treated as well, isn't it? He faces silence.
I quite like looking at that line in kind of tandem with the line that comes before it, in the stanza before as well, because you've got that enjambment between it. Only we children still chattered and laughed until gradually we too learned to be silent. And I think the kind of contrast between the kind of the joy that comes out of words like chattered and laughed, and you know, the kind of noise and something being quite full, there contrasts so strongly with that the start of the final stanza. And I think having that juxtaposition between the noise and the silence is quite poignant, quite kind of affecting.
Because I suppose from that you get the loss of noise, don't you? And with that, everything that it entails and that's led to that loss of noise and loss of joy.
Yeah, and this is definitely a comment on the way society affects people's views, isn't it? So these children who they just naturally want to be playful and they want to form relationships, that's a natural instinct, isn't it? But actually when they grow up, they realise other people aren't treating the father in a way that makes him feel included. They're cutting him off, they're ostracising him because of the fact that he's not fulfilled the Kamikaze mission. So they develop that understanding, and we'd probably call it prejudice, wouldn't we? So it's perhaps sort of a message from the writer that prejudice is something that is sort of learnt by the way society treats others, isn't it? Rather than it being something natural, it's something that
and I think Garland builds that up really nicely, doesn't she, in that second to last stanza. So obviously, Miss Leifert, you mentioned the children at the end of the stanza we're talking about now, but it begins with the mother not speaking to him again and not meeting his eyes, then the neighbours, two. So two is quite an important word, isn't it? It's like building more and more people that are cutting off that relationship.
Yes,
it's yet another effect of war there, isn't it? It's that because he doesn't contribute towards the war in the way that Japan expects, it means it just affects his life and it affects the views of everyone, doesn't it?
So I think there's that loss of connection, isn't there, for the father in the poem, and how, even though it's not from his perspective, we're getting it from his daughter's perspective, that loss of connection is so obvious to her, isn't it? Especially her looking back on this moment that he comes back, and the change that brings.
And it's quite a shocking line almost when it says he was no longer the father we loved. If you interpret that as being actually she doesn't love him anymore because she learns this prejudice, that's a really quite quite surprising, shocking idea, isn't it? That you would stop loving someone because they don't perform this act, which is would be take so much courage, wouldn't it, to actually go through with this Kamikaze mission? They'd lose love for him because of that. You just can't believe the impact that war has on an individual.
I'm thinking now, looking back at the entire poem with this interpretation in mind, do you get the sense the daughter regrets this like loss of connection?
I think so. I think
with the idea of recounting it to her children. Sorry, Miss Leifert, you were going to say something.
And I think the way that she makes it clear that this wasn't a natural loss of connection, this is something that she learned by the end. I always read it as almost quite a guilty tone at the end, that she feels certainly saddened and maybe some kind of regret towards the way that they treated him.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because we've done questions about guilt with these poems before, haven't we? And I would never necessarily think of Kamikaze as being one to choose, but it is, you could definitely interpret it like that, couldn't you? And I think the important thing to realise with this poem is these aren't necessarily, when she's remembering what happened to her father, it isn't necessarily what happened. She's trying to understand, isn't she?
Yeah, that's what made me think of that. It's the perspective that's really important in that sense, isn't it?
Yeah.
The need that it is her that is needing to recount this to her children. It's the daughter's perspective, trying to imagine the position that her father must have been in, meaning he must no longer either be there to tell it for himself, or he's been cut off to such an extent that it's no longer possible for him to recount his own story.
And if we're trying to link back to loss as being our comparison, do you think she feels as though she lost her father and this is a way to try and understand him and try and get that connection with him again?
I think that's a really nice interpretation.
She's not being critical, is she, of him? She understands why he turned back and why this was such a difficult situation for him. So
I think that idea of her using the poem as a vehicle to reconnect links to the Emigrée quite closely, because I think that has a similar purpose in that she is remembering the city that she's lost, that she's had to move away from, and that her memories and her recounting of her memories is a way of kind of reconnecting and keeping part of it close to her, maybe.
So like we said at the start, we're looking for a really effective comparison for similarities and then differences within those similarities. So suppose now we've found that loss of connection is a similarity between these poems, but do we think it's loss of a connection with people and family in Kamikaze versus loss of connection with a place in the Emigrée?
I would, but then I think you've got these hints that she feels like she has got a strong memory and she very actively tries to look after that memory, doesn't she? When you were saying that idea, I looked straight at the bit in the third stanza where it says, it lies down in front of me, docile as paper. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes. So I don't know how you interpret these lines, but the personification there, I always think of it as being the place itself and her memory of it, and it coming back to it and her trying to look after it. You get almost a parental image of someone looking after the other. I think of it as her trying to look after her memory. And because she wants to keep that close connection.
I was thinking there what you said is similar to how I interpret the line in the first stanza, my original view, the bright filled paperweight, this kind of metaphor whereby she's trying to hold down that memory. She doesn't want to lose it, and so it's quite a purposeful action. This memory is held down with this paperweight so that nothing escapes her. So she's kind of battling against the loss almost.
That's interesting, because I always thought of it as being so it's naturally held down because she can't forget that memory. But do you think it's something that she's doing purposefully because she doesn't want to? Does that make sense?
I think a paperweight is something you physically have to put on top of something that you don't want to blow away or lose. I know it's quite an old-fashioned thing, a paperweight, isn't it? But
I think that fits with the personification in the final stanza that you were just talking about, Mrs. Edmonds. So the idea of the city lying down, to me it's like a pet that has been trained to kind of lie down because of a command, because she is getting it to lie down in front of her.
Definitely, because docile, it means quite it's something quite easy to control, I think, isn't it? So in terms of loss, she's got this memory still, hasn't she? But she's the physical separation from her city, the place where she connects with, the place where she holds out her identity. It makes her feel very conflicted, I think, doesn't it? Especially when she doesn't feel as though she fits into this new place, and she doesn't feel the sense of connection at all.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I picked up on there what you said about the kind of physical barrier that's caused her loss, which is quite different to Kamikaze. There's no physical barrier between the daughter and the father when he comes back, whereas here we have got the frontiers that rise between them, and the fact that she has no passport later on. There's these very physical things that cause the loss.
Yeah, because clearly in Kamikaze he does return because of the need in the final stanza for there to be the simile as though he had never returned.
Yeah.
Where, you know, from the very first line of the Emigrée, she has physically left. I left it as a child.
Yeah, and it just seems an impossibility to return, doesn't it? Whether that's because the place itself has changed as a result of war, so it wouldn't be the place she remembers, or if it's because it's still affected by war, so it would be unsafe to return. Yeah, seeing that possibility, does there? The other thing that she's at the danger of losing is her language, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that child's vocabulary I carried here, like a hollow doll, opens and spills a grammar. So the idea of it, I always think of it because the vocabulary, the language she used to speak is hollow, almost like it doesn't mean anything here. Is that how you usually see that word? Or
it's not, but I certainly see it that way now you've said it.
Yeah, but she obviously wants to carry on using it and hold on to it, but the fact that she isn't really allowed to use it, or there's no need for it here, it definitely still has a connection to the idea of loss, because she'd rather be actively using that language and still be very much connected to it, wouldn't she?
I was thinking, I know I'm going backwards and forwards a little bit here, but that what we were talking about there with the idea of kind of losing a language or losing that sense of identity connects back to Kamikaze again, I think, with the father at the beginning and the powerful incantations and this kind of loss of control over yourself, or loss of kind of autonomy maybe through language, kind of is another connection that I'd maybe make.
Yeah. Should we, because you've just brought that in, should we move on to our second comparison then?
Yeah.
I think that probably would be a nice way in, wouldn't it? Because we've talked about relationships and the loss of that, but we haven't necessarily talked about the father's connection to war itself. Should we compare how the war affects an individual mentally?
Yeah.
In both of the poems. So the first stanza that you just picked up on, it's perfect to consider for that idea, isn't it? And the way that the war itself influences the father, and he must have been influenced by the things that he was told in war in order to go on this kamikaze mission initially, mustn't he?
Yeah. I really like analysing this first stanza because I think there's a lot in it. I think that first line, her father embarked at sunrise, that the idea of sunrise, or the imagery of sunrise, is very, or it could be connected to the Japanese flag, couldn't it? If you look at that, it's kind of red with this kind of sun in white, quite large on it. So I think that's maybe quite carefully chosen imagery there. And then you've got the shaven head, which is obviously quite a military image in terms of how he looks. And then, like we said before, these powerful incantations, these almost what you imagine to be kind of propaganda or kind of headlines, or however you want to see it, being compared to incantations, something magical, something supernatural, and kind of spells. All of those, I think, create that sense of someone being almost brainwashed and being kind of consumed by the military culture, or the kind of the way things were presented at that time in Japan.
Yeah, and I think that follows through into that final metaphor in that stanza, doesn't it? The one-way journey into history, which to me it seems like what the kamikaze pilot would have been told this mission was.
Yeah.
The one-way journey into history, a way of becoming godlike, I suppose, if we consider the information surrounding kamikaze pilots.
So the ultimate act of war, isn't it, that
Mm-hmm.
would prove yourself. And I think the word patriotism is really important here, isn't it? So
definitely.
you've got this strong sense of belonging to a certain place and feeling passionate about your country and feeling motivated in terms of your actions because of the place that you're from. So
I think it's interesting in this poem to consider the mental effects on individuals, because I suppose what we get in the first stanza and also in the final two stanzas is quite different to what we then get in between, with what the daughter imagines the father's looking down on.
Yeah, it's interesting, the things that she considered motivated him to return, isn't it?
Yeah. They're quite simple things, aren't they? Things like little fishing boats and obviously numerous references to fish, and then these kind of almost like childlike images that you have of them kind of building. I've lost it in the poem, but they build
the cairns
here of pebbles, which is kind of like little things you'd make almost like sea defences, aren't they? And quite simplistic things, which contrast with obviously these big ideas that you get in the first stanza. But they're things he hangs on to.
Yeah, it's almost like a return to maybe what's important for the pilot, as though almost freeing himself from the mental effects of war that he's clearly his head is clearly filled with in the first stanza.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that she wants to understand his perspective, doesn't she? And these are the things that she discusses.
Yeah. And I think there's that sense that obviously when we first talk about the mental effects of war, obviously we would consider them to have kind of detrimental or negative effects on someone's kind of mental well-being or the psychology of a character. But there is this sense that in these times of kind of trauma or war and kind of horrible things happening, there is that sense that actually one of the effects can be appreciating the smaller and more simple things in life. And is that one of the effects that it kind of had on the father? And then maybe therefore the daughter, in her reflecting back on it, she's kind of appreciating these things through his eyes, maybe.
Yeah, which at the time I suppose the people like the mother may not have done.
They, as though the things in the first stanza were the most important things, but then she's moving away from that and away from those incantations to perhaps things that are more important. I think it is very interesting that the writer only gives one stanza to these initial ideas and the things that motivated him, compared to the quite developed description across 4 stanzas of everything very natural that he sees, which persuade him to return. So if we think about those, so those being the mental effects on individuals in Kamikaze, and if we consider the idea of nature and the persona's relationship to nature, there's definite links to the Emigrée as well, isn't there?
Definitely.
When we see that some of the descriptions of the place, and this, I can't believe we've not mentioned the sunlight metaphor yet, because it's so important in the poem, isn't it?
Repeated so consistently throughout, right from the start, right up until the end.
And do you think that this sunlight represents her feelings and her memories towards the place that she was from?
Yeah, I think so. It's this kind of positive, kind of hopeful sense that she attaches to the place.
And before it's sick with tyrants, before it's presumably affected so badly by war.
Yeah, she still holds on to that memory of it as being sunlight and kind of bright and positive in her mind. I think it's interesting though what you said about tyrants and kind of bringing that in. I think like with Kamikaze, where you see the kind of the detrimental, the negative effects on the individual, there is the positive effects as well. I think Rumens does balance them in the Emigrée. You've got the sense of sunlight, the sense of positivity, the sense of kind of hope attached to the city, but then there are these kind of darker undercurrents that run throughout.
Yeah, I think the darkness is, to me, I always think the darkness is associated with the new city that she's had to move to. But then there's some interesting ideas of, so in the final section, if you think about the darkness being associated with the new city, it says, my city is in the city she moved from, hides behind me, they mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. And they're interesting lines, aren't they, to think about. It's almost as though despite the effect of the new city and it causing darkness, the idea of a shadow itself must always mean that there has been sunlight, so she'll always have that sort of behind her, feel that sense of positivity that she had when she lived in her original place.
Definitely. And I think there, in the same section you were talking about, they accuse me of absence, they circle me, they accuse me of being dark. I think we were talking about guilt in Kamikaze earlier, but I think there is a sense of guilt in the Emigrée, certainly in that final stanza, that even though perhaps leaving the city wasn't her choice and not something she necessarily had control over, I still think she feels guilty for not being there anymore and kind of not being able to protect it in the way that she'd like to. So I think that is another kind of psychological effect on the individual that war brings on, that kind of conflict in their sense of self and the guilt that might cause.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think we've got enough ideas there? Should we?
Talked about a lot.
Yeah, there's so many. If you managed to get everything down in a structured essay, you'd have plenty there, wouldn't you? Probably too much.
Yeah, more than you'd get down in 45 minutes.
Yes. Well, hopefully year 10 that's been helpful. So what we'd like you to do is note some of those ideas down in the essay plan that you've been sent, and hopefully the way that the sheet's structured will mean that you can use the ideas that we've shared, add in any of your own and fit them into the table. Just ask your teacher if you've got any questions or if you need any help with that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.